Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. The person chiefly responsible for inciting the natives to rebel against the Romans, the person thought most qualified to serve as their leader and to direct the entire course of their campaign, was Boudicca. She was a Briton, a woman of royal rank, and possessed of much greater intelligence than is usually the case with women. First, she mustered her forces, about 120,000 in all, and then she climbed onto a tribunal which had been fastened out of earth in the Roman manner. She was a woman of towering height and terrifying appearance, with fiercely flashing eyes and a rasping voice. A great mass of auburn hair fell tumbling to her hips. Around her neck, she wore a large golden torque, and she wore a heavy cloak fastened by a brooch over a brightly patterned tunic. This was how she always dressed. Reaching for a spear to add force to her words, she spoke to her army as follows. You now understand from personal experience how difficult of freedom and slavery. Some of you, because you did not previously appreciate this, may have been seduced by the 100 promises of the Romans. But now, because you have tried both, you have come to appreciate how terrible a mistake you made in preferring foreign occupation to your traditional way of life, and to realize that poverty without a master is always preferable to a slavery that makes you rich. For what shame have we not endured, and with what sufferings since first the Romans landed in Britain? So Boudicca is the first vivid personality in the whole of British history, and Cassius Dio is describing this great rebellion that she leads in AD 60. Rebellion against Roman rule that almost succeeds. And, we've been talking about the ambivalent attitude that people, certainly in Britain, feel towards the Romans. But there's also a kind of ambivalence towards Boudicca, isn't there? Because you could represent her as what? I think she was a freedom fighter, but she leaves a trail of destruction in her wake. Her forces commit appalling atrocities, as you'll hear, and I think that she's one of the very few people to have 2 statues in towns that she incinerated. So there's a very famous statue of her in London, which her forces burned down, but there's also one in Colchester, which she also incinerated. So a fascinating figure. I remember having done Boudicca at school, and I think we were always expected to empathize with her just a wee bit. She was this heroic figure, and in popular imagination, she hasn't become conflated, well, maybe just a little bit, with the figure of Britannia. I think on the chariot, that wild hair, the flashing eyes, the spear, all that kind of stuff. There is that element to it. I think because we have 2 detailed accounts of how her rebellion passes, with Cassius Dio, who I just referred to, but also with Tacitus, who was the greatest Roman historian and whose texts have become readily available in the Renaissance, and then through the modern period for British scholars, but also generally to have this incredibly dramatic figure at the wellspring of our history is just astounding. But of course, there is a kind of parallel between the figure of Boudicca and the figure of Britannia, who I referenced in my second episode, who first appears to us as someone who was actually being sexually assaulted by a very buff Claudius in Turkey. And as we'll see, what prompts Boudicca to her revolt is also sexual violence. So yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack here. But let's have a little bit of context. Last time we heard about how the Romans invaded in AD 43 under Claudius, and I described how they pacified the south and Midlands of the island of Britain. They beat the Cativalorni, That was the most powerful kingdom at the time, and they then turned their capital, Colchester, into a Roman colony, a colonia, which they settled with their veterans, and they built the biggest temple in the land to Claudius, the conqueror. But let me give you a little bit more context, just in case you didn't hear episode 2. So Colchester, what has become this colony, this kind of showcase for Roman civilization, it's confusing a little bit because although it was the Catavalorian capital, the Catavalorians had actually been an imperial power themselves. They'd conquered it from the Trinovantes, who were their neighbors. And so it's the poor Trinovantes who really suffer from the exactions of the settlers in Colchester. They're miserable. Whereas the Catavalorni, who are the people who the Romans defeat, they're absolutely fine. They're having a great time. They've got their main settlement at St. Albans, and all the Catavalorni there have since become magistrates and Roman citizens. They started to build Roman baths and all this kind of stuff, so they're actually really happy. They're leading a very good life. And keep in mind also, to the south of their kingdom are the Atrebates, a very stable tribe ruled by a very stable pro-Roman by the name of Togidubnus, who lives in the palace of Fishbourne. So the Catavalorni and the Atrebates are pro-Roman, and that's a really big, solid Roman bloc. And basically the Romans are confident that the southeast is now secure, which is why there was originally a legionary base in Colchester that's since been withdrawn, and it's been given over to veterans who have served their time and retired. Meanwhile, in the north, in Yorkshire and Lancashire, all of those kind of counties up there, you've got a tribe called the Brigantes, who are ruled by a very powerful queen called Cartimandua, who's an amazing survivor, and I'll come back to her a little bit later on. Of course, in Wales, an absolutely brutal and one might say genocidal war of pacification is now happening, led by the governor of Britain, Suetonius Paulinus, who is probably the most effective general in the entirety of the Roman Empire, which is why he has been sent to Britain. And he's giving the Druids in Anglesey one hell of a kicking. Suetonius Paulinus has gone to Anglesey basically because he feels that the southeast has been successfully pacified. He's not worried. And the Romans, as they usually do when they conquer a territory, they apply the carrot and the stick. So the carrots are the villas that they give to leading collaborators, the civic adornments, the Roman-style urban foundations based on meeting places. So St. Albans, Colchester, where they build baths and forums, that's the carrot. The stick, of course, is the risk that you will be slaughtered, enslaved, and raped. Man, woman, or child, it doesn't matter. It's about sending a message. And so essentially it creates for the Britons a choice. You can either collaborate and have things like baths and forums and, those kind of amazing things that the Romans love, or you can fight and either end up dead or in shackles, enslaved. And for me, I have to say, if I was to go back in time, that would be a no-brainer. I clearly don't love freedom as much as some people do. So let's talk about Boudicca. When I did this at school, I was always told that she was the queen of a people called the Iceni. Well, we've since come to realize that that was a mispronunciation, and their name is actually the Iceni. And there's an important road, a kind of a trackway, a very, very ancient trackway, much older than the Iceni themselves, called the Ickfield Way. So this goes from Icenian territory, which is in the south of East Anglia, all the way down to Wiltshire. And it's possible that that name comes from the Ickfield Way. The Iceni comes from the Ickfield Way. And it's going to play a very, very important part in Boudicca's story. Boudicca is the consort of what the Romans call a king, a rex. I mean, he's the kind of the head honcho of the Iceni, a man called Pratigus. It's also possible that Boudicca came from another tribe. We don't really know. But it doesn't really matter. The Iceni are a very distinctive people. I haven't talked about them a lot at this point because they haven't intruded on the Roman narrative to date. Keep in mind also, they're not a unitary kingdom. They're a kind of confederation, kind of a tribal league, but they're very cohesive. But they also have separate subdivisions, kind of separate cantons, if you want to describe it in that way. And they have had contact with Rome pretty early on. And I think it's also very probable that they're one of the important tribes that sent ambassadors to submit to Julius Caesar when he invaded 100 years before, back in 54. I think what's also incredibly interesting, and I think striking, is that based on the archaeology of the Iceni, they're much, much less in hoc to Roman culture than any of the other major tribal groupings. And so what we do find is that there's Roman coins are found there, but there's very little evidence of any kind of luxury goods. There's definitely no Roman wine, which is really unusual because all the other tribes by this stage are drinking Roman wine. And so the question is, why should this be? And I think one answer might be their geographical circumstances. They're further north. They're surrounded for much of their territory by the North Sea. And also the fens, which at this time are very, very impassable for large stretches. They haven't been drained at this stage, so there are huge swamps bordering on the southern reaches of the Iceni territory. And you can actually tell the way in which they are distinctive by looking at their coins, which I also talked about in episode 2. These coins are important because they're markers of a kind of cultural distinctiveness. For the first time, you can actually work out maybe, just maybe, what their ideology is of a particular tribal grouping by looking at their coins. And the thing that's absolutely striking about the Iceni coins is there's lots of striking stuff about them, I have to say. But the one really striking element is that unlike the coins of the other British tribes, they feature very heavily the wolf, which by this point is very rare in lowland Britain. And their wolf, it's very sinister. I've actually got one of their coins with the wolf on. And there's a brilliant description of it by Duncan Mackay in his wonderful book, Echolands, which is an amazing book about Boudicca, and it came out last year, and he writes extensively about the wolf. He describes it as an emaciated, beak-jawed, spiky-eared, and spindle-limbed creature that must have moved more like a spider than anything mammalian. It's very sinister. It's shown with birds that are clearly associated with the fens, so, lapwings and so forth. And this gives the sense that the wolf is a fen dweller, which in Germanic would be Fenrir. And Fenrir in Norse mythology is, of course, the great wolf that at the end of the world devours the sun. So this is very, very important. And there's another kind of echo, or perhaps foreshadowing of Norse mythology, that another series of early Icenian coins features this strange mask-like male head with a single eye. And of course, then there's the Oxford pneumaticist called Daphne Nash Briggs, who's written a lot about Icenian coins in a very stimulating way, I have to say. She writes saying that its lids are either closed or firmly sewn shut. And of course, as soon as you read that, it reminds you of Odin, the one-eyed god who rips out his eye for wisdom. And I think what's even more fascinating is that Nash Briggs argues that Icenian coins, in addition to having Latin and Brittonic languages, also have Germanic languages too. I have to say also, this linguistic evidence is also furiously debated. I mean, my gut feeling is that it's perfectly plausible that the Iceni, because they're open to the North Sea, in the way that, say, Wales or Cornwall had also been open to Celtic influences coming up from the Atlantic, it seems to me to be perfectly plausible that there might be kind of Germanic substratum in their culture, and that perhaps these coins reflect traditions that are percolating around long, long before the Viking period. Of course, we'll never really know, but it's supposition. But it's supposition, I think, with credence. It's definitely plausible to me that other traders were crossing the North Sea. Certainly not in the numbers that happened centuries later. But there must have been sea contacts between East Anglia and what will eventually become Holland and Denmark and Norway. I mean, it just seems improbable that there wouldn't be. And I think perhaps they offer a clue as to where Icanian culture is coming from. That perhaps this is why the Iceni are less influenced by what's happening in Gaul and more influenced perhaps by Germanic traditions that are crossing from Saxony and or from Scandinavia. And I don't think it's the case that they're actually consciously more isolationist and more exceptionalist. But I do think they're deliberately restricting Roman imports, and they're doing it because they're resisting the advances of Roman culture. And this is actually an argument that Daphne Nash Briggs pushes. You know, she points out that there must be Roman coins coming in because there is gold and silver that's being reminted in their own images. But they're certainly being melted down, deliberately melted down, and they almost certainly must be conscious restrictions on the import of wine, which is why we don't find any. And she suggests that it's an attempt, and I'll quote her directly, to mitigate destructive competition amongst armed aristocrats. And if that's the case, folks, it must be Praticus who is responsible for doing that, the man who becomes Boudicca's husband. And it suggests that he's walking a very delicate tightrope because the probability, and again, we're talking in terms of probability and possibility here, is that he was actually a hostage in Rome. You know, the royal children. He was probably one of the royal children of the British tribes that they seemed to send to Rome as a matter of course. So he would have absolutely been conscious of Roman power and Roman culture, but at the same time, he clearly seems to have a role in Icanian life that was more than just that of a king. He seems to have had a priestly status, and it's likely that Praticus is not a proper name, but also a title based on the evidence of his coins. It seems to have meant something like Pontifex Maximus, so a kind of high priest. So I think what's interesting about this is the man who actually mediates between the people and the gods actually marries Boudicca, who is the person who brings victory. So it actually suggests, if you kind of go about it in that roundabout way, that the victory giver marries the man who is the mediator between the gods. And I think what's really interesting about that is that there's a sacral dimension to this marriage. And of course, you all know I love a sacral dimension. And I think what's also interesting is that we can also identify a place where this holy couple, because I think you have to think about them as a holy couple, a sacral couple, where they may have presided. And today, it's actually under an industrial estate. So glamorous. And Duncan Mackay, in his book, you know, he's got this brilliant, funny account of him trying to track down this place where they were married that's so important in British history. And of course, he finds it, and there's nothing but crisp wrappers everywhere and, you know, Mars bars and all this kind of stuff. So when that industrial estate was actually being developed, archaeologists went in first, and they found that in the 50s AD, there was a massive artificial oak grove standing there. So there was great ranks of posts and fences, you know, kind of sticking up deliberately to look like a grove of oaks. And of course, keep in mind, oak groves were very particular to the Druids. They had a magic about them. So Nash Briggs basically says it's a symbolic grove. And what you get is an almost intangible, a sense of the Iceni as a people for whom the dimension of the supernatural is everywhere. It's actually part of their political dynamics, more so than any other tribe in Britain. And I think this also helps to explain why the Iceni, unlike the Catavalorni or the Trinovantes, are able to maintain their independence from Rome. There's something about them that Rome fears. Praticus is clearly a competent politician. And I think what's really interesting is that he's able to reassure the Romans that his independence, his tribe's independence, actually offers them no threat. And at the same time, he's able to dampen down all the ambitions among his fellow Icanians, even to the extent that in 47 there's a kind of Icanian rebellion, but the Romans don't interfere and they don't suppress it. And I think it's because of, possibly with the help of Pratigus, I think he placates them. And what we don't know is whether his collaboration actually did go that far, but it's amazing to me and other historians who have far much more knowledge about this than I do, is that Pratigus is actually able to maintain the independence of his people even after they have an uprising. But of course, that then leads to the risks that then face the Iceni as a tribe when Pratigus dies. So he dies in late 59 or early 60. And what we do know is that the political climate is very much alive, but he's doing everything he can to keep the Romans on board. And I then wondered if that was part of his plan. And I came to the conclusion that it is. So Tacitus then tells us what his plan is. He writes, Pratigus, king of the Iceni, famed for his long prosperity, had made the Roman emperor, who's Nero at this point, his heir along with his two daughters, under the impression that this token of submission would put his kingdom and his house out of the reach of the wrong. But the reverse was actually the result. And I think one of the main issues here is that Suetonius Paulinus, the governor of Britain at that time, whose job it was to mediate with Pratigus, to manage the politics of Britain, is actually away in Wales when Pratigus dies. He's up in Wales attacking and trying to wipe out the Druids. And the man on the spot at that particular time is the procurator, who's basically the guy in charge of all the finances. So he's kind of the chancellor of the exchequer, a man called Catastrophe. And it's actually his job to thumb down, to screw the money out of all the provincial leaders. Effectively, the province and other provinces within Britain all have to be made to pay for themselves. The problem with this is that Britain doesn't have the kind of urban infrastructure at this time that lends to taxation in a way that Greece or Egypt or Gaul might do. So he's constantly looking for ways to fill his treasure chests. And this issue was actually turbocharged by events actually taking place in Rome, in the imperial capital, because Nero is sitting back thinking, do we really need Britain? It's actually a bit of a dump. The English have, no sense of humor. There's really not that much there. Should we withdraw? And one of Nero's leading advisors is the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who's been his tutor. And Seneca is obscenely rich. And he's also playing politics very well, and he's lent enormous amounts of money to all the various British chieftains and kings and aristocrats. You would kind of think that's a strange thing for him to do, because how can he possibly be sure of getting that money back? And I think it's a little bit like China lending money to, say, the Sri Lankan government to build a naval base. And the Sri Lankan government, of course, is going to default, and the Chinese then can just move in and grab it. And I think Seneca did this as a way of getting hold of territory from the natives of Britain. So Seneca, alerted perhaps to the fact that Nero is thinking of pulling out of Britain, says, well, okay, I want my debts repaid, and they have to be repaid now. So he sends in debt collectors in the form of legions. And presumably, Pratigus is one of the people that he's lent money to. He's since died, so it kind of becomes the perfect storm. His will of turning his tribe and his lands over to Nero is ignored. And when Decianus, the procurator, sends in the heavies, they behave in a completely shameful manner. And again, to quote Tacitus, the kingdom of Pratigus was plundered by centurions, his house by slaves, as if they were the spoils of war. His wife, Boudicca, was scourged, which effectively means stripped, punished, and whipped, and his daughters outraged, raped. All the chief men of the Iceni, as if Rome had received the whole country as a gift, were stripped of their ancestral possessions, and the king's relatives were made slaves. So, even by Roman standards, this is an absolute outrage. It's sacrilege. This is a crime not just against them as women, but against the gods. And the thing that is really, really stupid about this is that this all happened while the biggest mass of Roman troops are actually in Wales. You know, the nearest legionary bases are in Lincoln and in Exeter, so hundreds of miles away. So this act is basically a mad, mad thing to have done. And although the speech that Dio gives us at the beginning, that I read to you at the beginning, and indeed, you know, his description of Boudicca is a fabrication, because keep in mind, he's writing a century after the events happened. You know, Boudicca with massive hair, flashing eyes, a spear in hand. You know, the Romans actually see her as a villain. But keep in mind, folks, she was stripped naked and whipped, and her daughters were raped in front of her. So she has justifiable cause. And I think it's also clear that Boudicca, you know, she who brings victory, is absolutely taking the lead. And the probability is that the great massing of the Iceni that Dio was describing in his passage is symbolic of the sacro dimensions of Boudicca's rule. But the thing that makes it so threatening to the Romans is that it's not just the Iceni who are planning a war of liberation. There are the Trinovantes as well, because they've effectively been made slaves in their own country. They were slaves to the Cativalorni, and of course now they're slaves to the Romans. And of course the focus for their loathing of Rome is Colchester, this colony of Roman veterans with its great monumental temple to a foreign autocrat. And so, an alliance with the Trinovantes provides Boudicca with the biggest swelling of armed forces that Britain has ever seen. And this is now the peril that the Romans are now facing, that the Iceni rebellion will incite other tribes to rise up against their rule, to proclaim their freedom all across Britain. And the gods seem to be foretelling exactly such an eventuality. So in Colchester, even before news of the Iceni uprising starts, a statue of victory topples over. A very bad omen. And women are roused to a strange frenzy, foretelling the doom of the city. And on the Thames estuary, a ghostly town shimmers and appears in flames. The oceans turn to blood, and when the tide goes out, what seem to be human bodies are left on the beach. These are not promising elements, and they're all very bloody disturbing. And the Iceni are on the march. And all these portents suggest that it's not going to end well for Colchester. Crikey, what a cliffhanger. Can the Romans wrest back control of the situation, or are their days in Britain numbered? And is Boudicca set fair for victory? Come back after the break and find out. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. Those moments in the fetid, suffocating darkness as the crammed hundreds waited for the bolts of the door to give way with the next reverberating blow, shaking the very foundations beneath are beyond imagining. All hope was now gone. The pleas for assistance had gone out days before, and for long days they had waited and held the precinct and the podium, and now the innermost sanctum of the temple. But no one had come, and they could no longer hold, for there was no man left standing in the doorway. The able-bodied were dead almost to the last. So that is from Echolands and Duncan Mackay, and he's describing the last moments of Colchester. Its defenders are besieged in the great temple of Claudius, outside the hordes of Iceni and Trinovantes, no doubt weapons in hand, moustaches bristling with bloodlust. What a horrible scene for anybody who's on Team Rome. Roman civilization embattled and about to fall. And just to emphasize that Colchester is a place where 17 years before, Caesar himself, the Emperor Claudius, had come with his war elephants to receive the kind of symbolic surrender of Britain. And ever since then, it's been consciously shaped as the great showcase capital of the new province. And the Temple of Claudius, it's by far the largest Roman structure ever to be built in Britain. It's on an enormous scale. It has this huge podium, this base, which is still there today in Colchester. It's about 85 by 105 feet. It rises to the height of an equivalent 6-story building. And Tatius himself describes it as an arrogant stronghold of foreign rule. So you can imagine the impact that it has, that it's designed to have. And of course, the temple is what you would expect of Roman colonia, of Roman culture, transported to the foreign land. It's got baths, it's got an enormous theatre, it's got great victory arches, all proclaiming the power and the might and the victory of Rome. And of course, Colchester has been settled by veterans, people from the legions who've retired with their families, who were given grants of land, given property, given a pension, and who in retirement almost certainly continue to display towards the defeated natives that is notoriously characteristic of legionnaires. It would be pretty awful if you're a native to be close to a legionary base. And I think it would be even worse if you're in the neighborhood of a colony of legionary veterans. So Colchester at this time has about 15,000 people, and it's surrounded by this overwhelming architecture and all these veterans who are considered elderly now. Of course, they're in their 40s and 50s, but they can still handle a sword and a shield. And it must have been absolutely inconceivable to them that they could possibly face any threat from the defeated Britons. They called them the Little Britons, this contemptuous word that was used for the people of the land. But then, of course, the news comes about the oceans turning to blood, about ghostly cities, and this is all very bad because everyone's very superstitious at this stage, and that the local people, especially the women, are howling and screaming in the streets. Then the news comes that the Iceni are sweeping towards them. The horrific realization that there's no military resources to hand. And keep in mind, there's no walls. Colchester has no fortifications. And there's no walls because, and I think it's a reflection that, in their self-confidence, that they don't really need them. But having said that, I don't think the inhabitants also despair. The veterans, they're perfectly capable of standing and fighting. And even though the city doesn't have defendable walls, the Temple of Claudius does. So they can retreat there. And they can encourage, all the townspeople to bring their belongings, bring their valuables, and cluster inside the temple walls. And what we do know is that some people actually hid their valuables before they arrived, because there was a famous find made in 2014 while they were digging up a shop in Colchester. They actually found a box that contained silver bracelets and a kind of military amulet and gold jewelry and earrings and so on, which is clearly a box that's been hidden by a veteran and his wife. And they've hidden it away for safekeeping, and of course they never come back to claim it. The expectation is that they will be able to hold out in the temple until armed relief comes, presumably from Lincoln or from one of the peripheral forts that surrounds the main legionary base, because that's the nearest supplier of troops. But here's the thing. Two things go wrong with this plan. The first is that the legionary relief force never arrives, and this isn't because of prevarication. The commander of the 9th Legion, which is based in Lincoln, is a very bold and dashing commander called Petilius Cerialis, and he sets out the moment that he's told of the desperate straits of the inhabitants of Colchester, the desperate straits that they find themselves in. The problem is that he's marching at absolutely full speed, but he also has no intelligence. And of course, back in Colchester, this massive army have proven unexpectedly determined in their attempts to force the temple. And this isn't what the Romans had been expecting. The Britons aren't proficient in the arts of sieges, but this time they're so determined to storm it that they lay siege to the temple complex for 2 days. Then they clearly force their way up the steps, and eventually the veterans defending the temple are overwhelmed, and the women and the children, the injured, the old who'd been sheltering inside the temple are all slaughtered to a man. So Tatius finds it surprising that the Britons have no interest in taking prisoners, either for ransom or for slavery, which is what the Romans would certainly do in that situation. Instead, he writes, their concern was only to slit throats and to set up giblets and to burn and to crucify. And Dio actually gives details of the horrible deaths and what's supposed to have happened, particularly to the high-ranking Roman women who were there. And look, folks, I don't usually read them, but I think I will because I think it's important to explain the violence of the Roman retribution later. So Dio writes that they are hung up naked, and the most noblest and distinguished women then have their breasts cut off and sewed to their mouths in order to make the women appear to be eating them. Afterwards, still alive, they impaled the women on sharp skewers run lengthways through their entire body. And having done that, they then put every fragment of the Roman presence to the torch. And this is actually quite challenging because most of the buildings, most of the houses in Colchester are actually built on a kind of a sandy clay. But I think what it bears witness to is the determination of the Britons, of the rebels, of the freedom fighters, if you like, to eradicate all evidence of Rome's grandeur and to leave it a monument to the humiliation of the occupier. So it's smoldering, it's covered in corpses, and if Dio's account is true, the Romans are spectacles of humiliation and death, of the kind, actually, that the Romans themselves, with their love of crucifixion, would have entirely understood. And they would have seen it as something monstrous and something appalling. So this is the ghastly spectacle that Portius Carialis is marching to. And he's very bold, he's very swashbuckling. You know, he's marching south at a rate of knots towards Lincoln. He's headstrong, and of course he marches straight into an ambush. The Iceni and the Trinovantes have destroyed Colchester, and they then swing around, suspecting that this is what's going to happen, and he walks right into it. His legion is completely wiped out. He's in command of the cavalry side of things, and he's barely able to withdraw, to retreat. But even that is a very close thing. So Colchester has been burned to the ground, and a legion has been badly mauled. And so it's unsurprising at this point that the procurator, Cassius Decianus, assumes that the province is lost, and he then flees himself to Gaul. Meanwhile, as I described in episode 2, Suetonius Paulinus has been putting the groves of the Druids in Anglesey to the torch. And this is where he is when news comes to him of what is happening down in the southeast. So he's got no time to enjoy his victory, and he immediately orders his men to fast march from Anglesey down Watling Street to the southeast. He has 2 troops of legions, the 14th and the 20th, about 16,000 men. He also sends orders to a man called Posphemus, who's the commander of the 2nd Legion in Exeter, to set out to join him. And it's essentially a mass muster of all the legionary forces in the province. And the likelihood is, although neither Tacitus or Dio specify this, that Suetonius Paulinus's cavalry advances ahead of his infantry down Watling Street, especially because he doesn't know what's going on. He needs intelligence. He needs to find out what Boudicca's up to. You know, is she threatening other cities? And so he gallops down Watling Street towards London. And keep in mind, too, Watling Street is an ancient trackway. And by now, it's a well-established Roman road. So he's actually able to get to London before Boudicca. And London, unlike Colchester, is very distinctive because there hadn't been As far as we know, any site there before. The Romans actually established London. It had never been a major tribal meeting center. And I think the reason why Rome builds there is very obvious, is because it's the lowest bridging point on the Thames, and the Romans have actually built a bridge over it at this time. It's a navigable river, and so ships coming from the continent can actually easily get there. And so London begins as a military base, but it's also incredibly well suited for trade. So Tacitus specifies what had been fueling its growth. He said London was teeming with merchants and merchant shipping. And we have amazing evidence from this from the Bloomberg tablets. Bloomberg actually have this great center off the Walbrook. And the Walbrook, of course, was the river that flowed into the Thames that London was originally built around. And so the watery character of the soil there has actually preserved organic material and enabled these incredible writing tablets to be preserved. And the earliest one comes from the very first decade of Roman rule. And it points to London already becoming this great commercial hub. In fact, it points to it being a place where if you're going to do business, you need to wear the properest business attire. So in a way, the kind of foreshadowing of the suit. It says, they're boasting throughout the whole market that you have lent money. Therefore, I ask you, please, in your own interest, not to appear shabby. So dress up and look smart. I love that. And of course, then there's another one. And this is actually the first data document in the whole of British history. And it dates from about the 8th of January, AD 58. And it's actually an IOU. So there are 12 documents in all from before AD 60. And it actually shows that London's already, it's literate, it's mercantile, with probably about 10 to 15,000 people. It's a kind of a Wild West hub. It's a boom town, but it's cosmopolitan. And it's got this kind of mix of Roman and native architectural styles. And the docks would have been full of ships from the continent. But as with Colchester, there's no walls. So effectively, it's a sitting duck. And Paulinus arrives without his legions and just with his cavalry. There's no prospect of holding the town, so he orders a mass evacuation. And I guess at this stage, the Londoners have three options. They can withdraw with Paulinus, they can cross the Thames, and if they do that, he probably would have destroyed London Bridge, or they have access to ships. They can actually get on ships and get out onto the water, because they also know that Boudicca doesn't have ships. But you would have also had the old, the infirm, the sick, even those who don't have pack animals to take their goods with them. And I think also probably, because this has never happened before, they're also probably thinking, well, maybe Boudicca won't come. Maybe it's going to be okay. Maybe everything will be fine. But Boudicca does come. And there's all kinds of archaeological evidence for what then happens. Perhaps most strikingly in the foundations of what is now number 1 Poultry, which is by Bank Tube Station in the heart of the city of London. And this is an office block that was designed by James Stirling and built in the 1990s. And before it was built, archaeologists went down into the depths and they found this layer of intense fire, and there's evidence of blackened timbers and burnt pottery and petrified mud brick. And this is evidence for a great fire, and really the first great fire that consumed London. And of course, this was when Boudicca burnt London to the ground and effectively obliterated it. So you can imagine that in St. Albans, which is some 20 to 25 miles away, the inhabitants there would have seen smoke rising from London as it burnt, and they would have known what was coming. And of course, unlike London, St. Albans had been built as a Roman foundation on a tribal center, and it's the capital of the Catavalorni, who are the enemies of the Trinovantes. And so it's a reminder, I think, that Boudicca is not just fighting a war from freedom from the Romans, but she's also engaged in an intra-tribal war of the kind that had been convulsing in southeastern Britain for decades and decades before the Romans arrived. There are existing rivalries that are being ramped up, amplified by the arrival of a colonizing outsider. And so in St. Albans, everybody knows that she's going to be coming for them. Particularly the Trinovantes will be coming for the Cativalorni. Paulinus at this point presumably hasn't joined his legions, and so again he has no choice but to evacuate the city, and again St. Albans, when she arrives, is put to the torch. So that's the third city that has been incinerated by Boudicca and her forces. And this is obviously a moment of incredible peril for the governor, but also for the entire future of Roman rule in Britain, because withdrawing from St. Albans in particular, this is a city that is emblematic of the perks that you get for collaborating with Rome. And the fact that the Romans have been unable to defend the Cativalorian capital is potentially fatal to the entire system of alliances that the Romans have built up, because the Cativalorni and also, Togidubnus down to the south and his kingdom, the Atrebates, they must be by this point weighing up the odds and trying to decide which horse to back. And here's the thing, why would you stick with the colonizer who can't even defend its own cities? That means for Suetonius Paulinus, he needs to force a battle very soon, because if he doesn't, the whole infrastructure of Roman Britain is going to fall to pieces. And the other reason why he wants to force a battle, I think, very soon is because there is always a risk that Boudicca's forces might split up and start separating. And then it becomes obviously much harder to wipe out the entire force in a single go. In the context of Britain, there are now two theories about what happens next. The first is that Paulinus has to retreat back up Watling Street to rendezvous with his men who still haven't arrived from Anglesey to join him. And he retreats and retreats and retreats until he meets with his infantry coming down Watling Street. And keep in mind, his men have force marched more than 130 miles in full armor. And of course, there's still no sign of the Second Legion coming from Exeter. They haven't arrived. But Paulinus decides he can't afford to wait for them. He's massively outnumbered, but he decides to make a stand against Boudicca's army, which has been, in theory, pursuing him up Watling Street for days. Tacitus then gives a description. He says he chose a position in a defile with a thick wood at his rear. I mean, that's actually very vague, but there is an element of precision to it because Tacitus, as I said in episode 2, is the son-in-law of Agricola, who is a man who was actually serving on Paulinus's staff. So he's very well informed. He's a very well-informed first witness. And the defile means that they can't be outflanked because there's a wood behind him. And of course, his army proves way too professional for the Britons. Boudicca's army is obviously not professional. It's not a well-organized army like the Roman army. It's much more of a horde. And at the back of this army, there are men and women and children following in carts. So you can imagine this as one long, long file going back tens of miles. But keep in mind also, they have burned 3 substantial Roman cities, and they've also wiped out a Roman legion. So it's an entire people on the march, the first time in the Britain's history, and they're marching on a biblical scale. And that's why this battle is so important to the Romans, because it actually gives them a chance to exact a kind of genocidal revenge. And essentially, Roman military training, I talked about this in episode 1 and 2, and I talked about the way the Britons fight. They fight by charging. The Roman training is about fending off that first charge. If it can be blocked, then essentially whoever's attacking you are doomed. And all of Roman military training is about ensuring that the legions can hold that very first charge. Psychologically, it's very important, but it's also important in terms of kit, equipment, and armor. So the legion starts moving forward, the Britons charge. Keep in mind also, the Romans have the gladius, the stabbing sword, which is designed to eviscerate, to split open stomachs. And most of the Britons, if not all of them, don't have body armor. So very, very rapidly, the battleground becomes a great sea of blood and gut spilling, and the Romans wading through it, taking one step forward at a time. The Britons are wiped out. The men, the women, the children are all put to the sword. This is Rome now sending a message. The wagons and the animals are burnt and slaughtered. As I say, this is pointedly genocidal, and this is slaughter on an enormous scale. I guess the other question I had was, well, where is this actually fought? So the favourite candidate is a place called Manchester in the Midlands, about 75 miles up Watling Street from St Albans. But I have an alternative theory after reading Duncan Mackay's book, Echolands, and he hinted at it too. And I think also because it's the most recent book that I've read on Boudicca, I'm completely convinced by it. I think the case arguments are actually very convincing. And Mackay says that it's actually St. Albans where the rendezvous between Paulinus and his cavalry and the infantry happen and the clash with Boudicca. He can't afford to keep retreating for all the reasons that I've given. And much more than that, he asks the obvious question, which I've never, in the various accounts of Boudicca, I've never heard asked before, which is, why would Boudicca continue to pursue him, knowing that he's about to relink with his legions? If you think about it in the Britons' context, she's got harvest coming. They all do. And she doesn't want to go running around Britain chasing Romans. She's done what she set out to do. She wanted to inflict humiliation on her two great enemies, on the Romans and on the Catavalorni. And she's done that. In the process, she's got enormous amounts of loot. And I'll just read to you what Mackay said. The lure of Colchester, London, and St. Albans has kept the vast tribal confederation together, and it proved itself the equal of the 9th Legion. It was still willing and able to fight, but resolve must have been fast dissolving as the ancient route along the Iceni Way came within the orbit of the hungry scouts and desperate foraging parties. They were, after all, farmers, and this was the blessed track that led the way back to their farms. So St. Albans is the point where the Iceni Way and Watling Street meet. I think the likelihood is that, and Mackay argues this, that Paulinus occupies that particular meeting point. He needs this victory. And he pinpoints a place called Winbridge Farm, which is a little bit north of now what is St. Albans. And there's still a road there now. And topographically, it actually matches Tacitus's description. It's strategically placed on two great roads. And intriguingly, folks, over 60 lead slingshots, apparently of a kind used by the Roman army, have actually been found there in the last few years. So for me, it's definitively the site of the battle. But you know what? In the end, does it really matter? I mean, who actually cares where the battle took place when we know what the result is? And of course, it's the result that matters. And it's often said that Taunton in the War of the Roses is the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. But I think this is the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. And I'd convincingly argue that perhaps 40,000 Britons lost their lives on this day. She would have had that many people. Boudicca had raised the largest army in history. And as I said, it would have been an enormous slaughter. And this is exactly what the Romans are setting out to do. They have basically the mass of two peoples, the Iceni and the Trinovantes, and they can do with them what they want. And that battle, that slaughter, that massacre is then followed up by further slaughter and devastation. Because the Romans are, they've been shaken. They feel humiliated. But clearly, they're also out for revenge because they've been to Colchester, they've been to London, they've seen St. Albans, and they know what she's done. And actually, there are so many reprisals, and they're so bloody that eventually they become too much for even the Roman leaders. And in 61, Paulinus is actually replaced as governor. He goes back, he's saved Britain, and he has a very distinguished career, and he ends up embroiled in the civil wars of 69, where there were 4 emperors. And he essentially has a better retirement than any of the other leaders who end up in Britain. So Boudicca, what happened to her? Well, Dio says that she was buried by her people, but I think that's really unlikely because they were all slaughtered. Tacitus says that she poisoned herself, but Tacitus was a misogynist, and he always gave women the coward's way out, which is what poisoning would have been. So as early as 1624, there was an antiquarian called Edmund Bolton who suggested that she was actually buried at Stonehenge, and that Stonehenge had actually been raised as her tomb. And I love that theory. I think that would be so symbolic to do something like that of her, but I think it's actually unlikely. In 1879, workmen found 3 tombs outside a village in Gloucestershire called Birdlip that were dated back to the middle of the 1st century AD. And the central grave was a skeleton of a woman with sumptuous grave goods. But again, you have to wonder, that's a very long way from St. Albans. You know, that's like 100 miles away. So how would they get there? How would they get her there if they were all being slaughtered in the process? But I think the best theory, which was proposed in 1937 by a former editor of The Scotsman called Lewis Spence, is that she was buried in the facility of King's Cross railway station in London. And he actually based this theory on an elephant that was found at that site. And he argued a Roman elephant, but it actually wasn't. It was Paleolithic. And yes, that area had been a Roman camp, but here's the thing, the Romans would never have venerated her in that way. The reality is that I think she was probably cremated, as were most of the bodies who were left on the field. And that being the case, she would never have had a recoverable grave. No inscriptions, no grave goods, no identifiable mound. Which in a way is actually fitting. You know, Rome recorded her as a problem, a rebel, a warning, and Britain remembers her as a symbol. You know, her body vanished, but her story certainly did not. And of course, that's the end of her story, but it's not the end of the Roman Britain series, because of course, there is still much of Britain left to conquer. And in the next episode, I'll be turning to somebody who really caught my imagination back when I was a boy reading my Ladybird books about the Roman Britain, and that is Agricola, and the story of his great adventures as he heads north into Scotland that will have you absolutely on the edge of your seat. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.
Thank you.